The problem about Rowan's approach to this is that, on the one hand, simply to accommodate the Sharia law is very difficult within a legal framework. Barno looked at this, and in her research was quite clear that actually the majority of Muslims that she talked to did not want that kind of accommodation. They didn't want a formal framework. They didn't want that kind of acknowledgement of difference. They preferred to maintain an informality in that kind of approach. And there were lots of arguments. The women that she spoke to argued vociferously that they felt that if you accommodated this formally into UK law, there could be abuses of power, all the kind of arguments that we would want to put forward. And Williams was aware of this, therefore he wanted to have a framework of responsibility that would be there, making those who actually administered Sharia law accountable to each other and to the wider law in some way. And that was okay as far as it went. But his view of responsibility was limited. So my argument is that he certainly wanted to get into the conversation, and he certainly wanted to move into some sense of accountability to law and to each other, but he missed the third element of responsibility. In an Aristotelian approach and in further developments on responsibility, there tend to be three levels, interactive levels of responsibility. One is the idea of agency. I am responsible for what I think and for the effects that I have upon others and upon the world. Secondly, the idea of accountability. I am accountable to certain people, stakeholders or whatever, and therefore I need to have the capacity to give an account of my thinking and my actions. But thirdly, a much wider notion of responsibility, and that's the idea of liability. This is the idea of shared responsibility with others for what we have, our community, our environment, and so forth. And one of the problems I want to argue with Williams' approach is that, in fact, he missed that out. And therefore, the core of his argument was all about accommodating difference, not actually looking at how difference can work together in shared responsibility, and how difference in that situation was, and is, I would argue, critical to any response in terms of society, any notion of multiculturalism. Gulen has a strong sense throughout his writing of responsibility, and it's a fascinating area. You can see how his thinking about responsibility has elements of Aristotelian thought. You can see how elements of it even move into sort of possibly existential. You know, I must take responsibility for my being and my response, and certainly elements of it move into that dreadful notion of postmodernity. I'm not going to define postmodernity. I'm not sure if it exists. Let's forget about those kind of terms just for the time being. But I want to argue that actually that notion of responsibility sits at the heart of a model of multiculturalism which I think he has to offer to society. The first part of that has an accountability which is directly faced towards God. So the individual and the Islamic world are responsible to God. This is based in creation theology, and clearly, as we've heard throughout the conference, this establishes this notion of vicegerency. It is up to us to give an account in action to God and in thinking to God. From that, he moves into a strong sense of that notion of responsibility as agency. Agency for us Westerners, for Westerners, sorry, forgive me, is so often seen as an individualistic thing, and so often seen as based around freedom. And so we often have the Isaiah Berlin distinction between freedom from or freedom to. You are free, you are an agent insofar as that you are free from oppression, you are an agent insofar as you are free to do something. Gulen takes it much further than that. A step on from that would be freedom to do your duty. Michael Novak. Does Michael Novak still operate in the US? Yeah, it does. Yes. Was that an approving or a disapproving? It was a disapproving Well, there you go. Gulen takes it beyond that, and this is something about freedom to create. Because if you're into creation theology and you have to respond to the impetus of God's creation, then you are about the freedom to create. It's a much richer notion of agency. But then he moves on wonderfully to this notion of liability, and I want to focus on that for a little bit. How's the timing? 5 minutes. Oh gosh. I'll briefly point out. Basically, it seems to me this notion of universal responsibility is where Gulen joins hands with an awful lot of these postmodern thinkers, from Levinas to Bauman and all these characters. The notion that we have to act as if we are responsible for everything and everybody, past, present, and future. An extraordinary thought. I mentioned that in a lecture to the European Business Ethics Network, actually in Turkey 3 years ago, and the response was a mystification. How can business people be responsible for everything in the past, the present, and the future? We had a good conversation. It was mostly American academics who couldn't cope with this, which was interesting. But he focuses on on that core notion of universal responsibility. As that develops, this is quite clearly based in the notion of being responsible in fact. We've heard this before, the notion that there is a spirituality at the core of Gulen, which is cognitive, affective, and somatic, and social. We want to see what it means. His spirituality is about seeing what the difference is. It's not about just knowing the idea of it, it's seeing the difference. And clearly that demands that we work together toward that. I can see it.
If we look at Sharia law in light of this situation, and by looking at Sharia law, we may discover some way of giving a contribution to the process through Islam. There is a different view from Islam than the popular view in the public today. We have to reinterpret our own values as Muslims, and we have to make those relevant to today, but at the same time, they stand in their own right. It's complicated because of one thing. When it comes to democratization, which is one of the foci here, when it comes to democratization, there is a tendency of the highly democratic countries in the world to impose their democracy. And of course, I have argued that vehemently for a long time. In fact, this whole paper excited me because he's very, very smart. He agrees with me. And Gülen starts with the proposition, you cannot use coercion in matters of religion. And he says, I add also that we should not use coercion in matters of politics. That is not the way a democracy properly works. And I think that's an interesting point at which he believes, as a Muslim, that we can begin to talk to each other. Nevertheless, in this situation, where there are great differences, Islam has benefited economically in some quarters more than in others, but it has benefited. Yet, cultural and moral and religious values resist coercion and are not being properly attended because they are not themselves a part of the coercive activity. I think that's an important insight. That was helpful to me. Right path between prohibition and permission has always been an interest of Islam, and we seek to follow that path. Between the potential conflicts between Islam and globalization, the task is to find that balance. But today, there's an added dimension, and that dimension is urgency. Urgency means that we can no longer go off into our exclusive camps without regard to our common task because of the provenance of globalization. Now, there are some things Sharia does not ban outright. There are things that are possibly permissible. In other words, you have to negotiate them in Sharia, he argues. And he says, the presumption of permissibility of using everything that is not banned by the Quran or the Prophet's Sunnah can be applied. In other words, in the guidance of Sharia, there is wiggle room. And he believes it should have that wiggle room. Not everything is established rigidly by law. To get to our basic principles as Muslims, we must return to the idea of the cross-cultural values that we share. But how will we know that? We know that by dialogue. Now, that's already an introduction to Gulen himself. Now, here's what he said we must do, first of all, and I see the Gulen movement having taken this on dramatically, and that is we have to introduce Islam to the West. I think that's the reason I said last night I've been in a steep learning curve, because my abysmal ignorance of Islam was threatening me, and I didn't know exactly why, but part of it, this paper says, is globalization.
In my mind, a rather unique characteristic of the Gulen movement that demands a more thorough analysis and attention. On the whole, the emerging literature on both the works of Fethullah Gülen and the Gulen movement, which we should note spans the academic and non-academic divide, can be divided into two broad categories. On the one hand, we might list works that focus broadly on the theological bases and ethical aspirations of Gülen's oeuvre and the Gulen movement. Works in this vein, including much of Gülen's own writing, tend to emphasize questions of interreligious dialogue, Gülen's relationship to strands and concepts in Islamic theology such as Sufism, and other broadly theological and ethical questions. On the other hand, a second category of literature pays specific attention to the sociological formations and political implications of the Gulen movement. I'm thinking here much of Hakan Yavuz's work, also Berna Turum's Between Islam and the State. Undoubtedly, each of these two sets of literature about Gülen and the Hizmet movement have made crucial contributions to a more thorough understanding of contemporary Islam, both in Turkey and globally.
Gülen makes a serious statement about how the democratization process, which is inevitable, can be contributed to by Islam if Islam will carefully reinterpret its own self-understanding, and how Islam can be shaped, on the other hand, by that process. And he's fairly critical of Islam from an insider's position, but he's critical in a creative way. Nothing destructive at all. He goes back to the great principles of Islam, which are never in doubt or questioned for him, but he says those can be made manifest in a world that has changed profoundly, namely globalized democracy.